The boardroom smelled like leather and cedar. Yuan pulled his sleeve down. Not fast enough. Tajuan Moro's eyes caught it, that half-second of purple at the wrist. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. He just set his pen down on the glass table very slowly, the way a man does when he's decided something. Who hurt you? Not soft, not sympathetic, analytical. The question landed like a surgical cut, clean, precise, and impossible to walk away from. The 12 other people in the boardroom went quiet, the kind of quiet where no one breathes too loud. Tajuan hadn't raised his voice. He never raised his voice. That was the thing about him that everyone at Baiko Financial knew and chose to pretend they didn't know. He didn't need volume. He needed data. Yuan straightened his jacket. Every reflex in his body was telling him to smile, to redirect, to say he tripped or bumped into a filing cabinet or some other harmless thing that nobody would question. He'd practiced those answers. He'd used them before. They worked on people who weren't paying attention. Tajuan Moro was always paying attention. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately mapped every exit. Who sat at the head of tables not because he needed the title, but because the angle gave him sight lines to every face. 41 years old. 6'2". The kind of stillness that made people nervous. Not because he was mean, but because he was accurate. Yuan had worked at Baiko for 3 years. He knew Tajuan by reputation first. Everyone did. Chief Operations Officer who rebuilt the entire compliance infrastructure after the 2019 audit scandal. Who fired 17 people in 1 quarter and not one of them could legally dispute it. Who ran his division like a controlled experiment, every variable accounted for. Yuan had been careful. He'd been so careful. The sleeve had shifted during the presentation when he reached across the table to hand over the Q4 projection deck. Just 2 inches of fabric. Just 1 second of exposure. That was all it took. I'm fine, Yuan said. Tajuan looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood up. Turned to the room. We're done for today. Clear the floor. No one argued. They gathered their tablets and folders and filed out in the specific silence of people who understood they were not being dismissed. They were being removed. The door clicked shut. The room was suddenly just the 2 of them and the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district 40 stories below. Tajuan crossed to the side credenza, opened his laptop, turned it to face Yuan. Security footage. Internal. Time-stamped from the 14th floor stairwell. 43 seconds of what Yuan had spent 6 months trying to make invisible. Yuan's throat tightened. His hands stayed flat on the table because if he moved them, they would shake. That's from this morning, Tajuan said. I've already pulled footage from the last 30 days. I have 7 incidents documented. 3 in the stairwell, 2 in the parking structure, 1 in the copy room, 1 in the elevator on the 18th floor. He paused. I have timestamps. I have him on camera within 1 minute of each instance. Hi viewers. Have you ever stayed silent about something that was happening to you because you were afraid no one would believe you? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know. Yuan didn't speak. His chest was doing something complicated, the kind of pressure that happens when you've been holding a weight for so long your body forgets what it feels like to put it down. I haven't filed anything, Yuan said carefully. I know. I didn't come to you. I know that too. The room was still. Below them, 40 floors of city noise that couldn't reach this high. Tajuan sat back down, opened a folder, slid a single sheet across the glass table, a printed internal compliance form with a name already filled in at the top. Choi Min-jae, Senior Director of Institutional Accounts. 13 years at Baiko. I need you to confirm, Tajuan said. His voice hadn't changed once. Still measured. Still exact. Not for me. For the record. He looked at Yuan directly. Say his name. Yuan stared at the paper. 6 months of silence. 6 months of calculating risk, his job, his visa status, his reputation, the way people look at you when you say certain things out loud. All of it compressed into this one moment. This one table. This one man who had pulled security footage and built a file before Yuan had said a single word. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just starts collecting evidence. Yuan opened his mouth. And before he could speak, Tajuan said quietly, I already know who did it. It started with a scheduling change. That was how Yuan would explain it later, if he ever explained it at all. That the first time Choi Min-jae crossed the line, it looked exactly like a scheduling change. A reassignment. A closed-door meeting that ran 40 minutes over. A hand on the back of Yuan's chair that stayed 3 seconds too long. 3 seconds. That was the thing about the beginning. It was always something you could explain away. A misread. An accident. A cultural difference, you told yourself, because Choi had been in the industry for over a decade and everyone respected him, and maybe you were being too sensitive, too new, too eager to make problems where there weren't any. Yuan had been 28 when he took the position at Baiko. Fresh out of a 2-year contract with a Hong Kong consulting firm. His English was clean, his numbers were cleaner, and he came in with a referral from a contact in the Seoul office who said Baiko was building something real. He believed it. He wanted to believe it. Choi Min-jae was the first person who extended a hand. Mentor. That was the word people used. Choi took Yuan through the institutional accounts division like a guide walking you through a building he'd helped construct. He knew every system, every client, every policy workaround. He introduced Yuan to the right people at the right events. He CC'd him on emails that mattered. He said things like, you have the instincts for this, and not everyone gets that fast, you do. Yuan felt it. That pull. When someone older and established looks at you like you're worth something, it moves through you in a way that's hard to name. Felt like being chosen. That was the design. By month 3, the pattern had shifted so slowly Yuan hadn't tracked the distance. Choi would call at 11 at night with quick questions about client files. Would stop by Yuan's workstation to review reports in a way that required standing close, too close, and holding eye contact a beat longer than necessary. Would find reasons for Yuan to stay late. Would send messages through internal channels that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with pressure. Yuan flagged one of the late-night calls to a colleague once. The colleague laughed. That's just how Choi operates. He's intense, but he produces. Just roll with it. Roll with it. That was the institutional answer to the institutional problem. Not policy. Not procedure. Just absorption. Just endurance dressed up as professionalism. Month 5. The stairwell on the 14th floor became the location Choi preferred for what he called check-ins. Away from cameras, Yuan thought. He didn't realize until much later that the stairwells had been upgraded to full coverage. Choi knew. Choi chose those spaces anyway, because the footage required administrative clearance to access, and Choi had sat on the compliance subcommittee for 6 years. That detail mattered. Yuan learned it later. The day the bruises started, the grip, the physical assertion of what had until then been only psychological. Yuan went home and sat in his apartment for 4 hours without turning on a light. He ran the math. If he reported it, it was his word against a 13-year company veteran with institutional relationships and a compliance background. If he stayed silent, he kept his visa sponsorship, his salary, his position. If he left, he had no explanation that wouldn't follow him into the next role. Every door had a cost. He chose the door that seemed to have the smallest one. He stayed. No one will believe you. Choi had said it quietly, almost gently, in the stairwell after the 3rd incident. Not a threat. A statement of fact delivered in the same tone he used to explain quarterly projections. Matter of fact. Confident. You've been here less than a year. I've been here since before this building was renovated. Think about what that means. Yuan knew exactly what it meant. He built walls. Invisible ones. He learned which hallways Choi used, which elevator bank he preferred, which hours felt lower risk. He moved through Baiko like a man navigating a space with a slow gas leak. Carefully, always aware, always calculating. 6 months passed. He never filed a report. He never told anyone. And then one morning, he reached across a boardroom table to hand over a Q4 projection deck, and his sleeve shifted 2 inches. That same morning, before Yuan ever stepped into that boardroom, Tajuan Moro had already submitted a formal request. Full HR compliance audit. Every department, every director-level employee, The request cited irregular pattern flagging from BICO's internal behavior monitoring system. The kind of audit that would require every access log, every badge scan, every communication record across the institutional accounts division for the past 12 months. Choi Min-jae's name was not on the request. It didn't need to be. Choi Min-jae didn't come in on Monday. His badge scanned the parking structure at 7:42 a.m. That part was on record. But by 8:15, when his assistant sent the third confirmation message about a 9 a.m. client call that Choi had arranged himself, there was no answer. By 9:30, HR had been contacted. By 10 o'clock, the call had come down from Ta-Juin's office. Choi Min-jae was suspended pending internal misconduct review. No announcement, no company-wide email, no press. Just a badge deactivated and a calendar cleared and a chair at the senior director's table that stayed empty. Yuan found out through his work phone. A message from HR informing him that he'd been temporarily reassigned to report directly to the operations division for the duration of the review process. One paragraph. Professional. Bloodless. He read it 3 times standing in the elevator. His first feeling wasn't relief. It was dread. Because suspension meant investigation. And investigation meant documentation. And documentation meant Yuan's name would eventually be in a file that other people read. People who would have questions. People who would want statements. People who worked in the same building and had coffee with the same colleagues and would be having conversations about this behind closed doors starting today. He'd kept himself invisible for 6 months. That was the one thing he'd managed to hold onto, invisibility. His work was clean. His record was clean. No one outside of that stairwell knew what the inside of those 6 months actually looked like. Now there was a compliance audit running through the entire division. Ta-Juin had built a box around Choi without Yuan's consent, and without his name. That should have felt like protection. Felt like exposure. Yuan requested a meeting. Ta-Juin's assistant scheduled it for 4 p.m. The office was quieter than the boardroom. No long table. Just a desk and 2 chairs and windows with the same view of the city. Ta-Juin was standing when Yuan walked in, reading something on a tablet. He set it down without rushing. "You didn't ask me before you filed the audit," Yuan said. "No, that's my..." Yuan stopped. "Reorganized. This affects me directly." "It affects 14 people directly," Ta-Juin said. "You're one of them. The audit isn't about you. It's about the system that allowed it." That was the distinction he kept making. System, not individual. Process, not person. Yuan had come in ready to argue about privacy, about control, about the right to handle his own situation on his own timeline, and Ta-Juin kept redirecting every point upward, past the personal into the structural. "What happens to my name?" Yuan asked. "Protected. The audit is compliance-facing only. Your identity isn't disclosed in any documentation I've filed. And the investigation? Misconduct review. HR conducts it. I don't have access to their process." Ta-Juin paused. "I also made a separate contact." Yuan looked at him. "Investigative journalist. Education and finance sector. She's been building a piece on institutional misconduct cover-up patterns in financial services for 8 months. I sent her a document packet. General. No identities. Systemic behavior patterns, policy gaps, response failures. You leaked company information. I shared publicly disclosable compliance failure data with a credentialed journalist." Ta-Juin's tone didn't shift. BICO's legal team reviewed the same data last quarter and buried it. That choice has a consequence. Yuan stood there. He thought about the 6 months. The stairwells, the calculations he'd run in his head, over and over, every angle, every risk, every door that cost too much to open. He had never once thought about the angle Ta-Juin was working from. Not revenge. Not protection in the traditional sense. Not the kind of thing where someone bigger steps in front of you and absorbs the impact. This was different. Ta-Juin was building a record. A legal, documented, institutional record that would survive a lawsuit, a counter-narrative, a 13-year employment history. He was making something that couldn't be quietly walked back or reframed. That mattered. Yuan exhaled. The journalist. She called Baiko's media contact at 2 p.m. today requesting comment on internal harassment policy enforcement gaps. Baiko's communications team had 4 hours to prepare a response. They didn't know what had been submitted. They didn't know what she had. Yuan processed that. What happens next? Tajuan's phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at it once. That's her follow-up. He turned the phone so Yuan could see the preview. Then his expression shifted just slightly. The controlled precision of his face developing one small crack. He picked up the phone. Read the full message. Looked up. Someone else filed, he said. An anonymous whistleblower email came through Baiko's ethics hotline 20 minutes ago. He set the phone down slowly. With documentation I've never seen. Yuan hadn't submitted anything. He hadn't filed a single document. Someone else knew. By Tuesday morning, the headline existed. Hadn't gone wide yet. Just a business news vertical with a mid-sized readership, the kind of outlet that finance professionals follow but most people outside the sector scroll past. The headline read, Financial Tower Harassment Cover-Up? Baiko Internal Audit raises questions about director-level accountability. 37 words. By noon, it had been shared 1,200 times. Yuan read it on his phone in the company bathroom with the door locked. He stood with his back against the wall and his eyes moving through the same paragraph 3 times because his brain kept skipping over the words. The article didn't name him. It didn't name Choi directly. It referred to a senior director under review and a pattern of complaints that HR records indicate were not escalated per required protocol. But Baiko was named. The building was named. The division was described closely enough that anyone inside the company would know exactly which floor was being discussed. Yuan washed his hands, looked at himself in the mirror. His face was steady. He'd spent years learning to make his face steady. The skill had cost him something, but it worked. He walked back to his workstation. By 1 p.m., the board chair had sent an emergency message to all C-suite and director-level staff. Mandatory call at 3. No agenda listed. That alone told everyone everything. When leadership doesn't put an agenda on an emergency meeting, it means they don't know yet how bad the damage is and they don't want to commit to a shape before they understand the size. Tajuan was on the call. Yuan was not. He spent those 40 minutes at his desk doing actual work, running numbers, reviewing fund allocation reports, the kind of structural tasks that don't require thinking because the formula does the thinking for you. It helped. It kept his hands busy and his face forward and gave anyone walking past a reason to believe everything was fine. The shareholders were not fine. By 4 p.m., Baiko's institutional investor relations inbox had received messages from 3 major stakeholders requesting clarification on the article. One had flagged it to their own legal team. Another had forwarded it to a compliance consultant they retained independently. These weren't panic moves, they were process moves. Investors at that level don't react emotionally. They activate procedures. Yuan understood procedures. That night, he went home. His apartment was on the 22nd floor of a building 6 blocks from Baiko. He'd chosen it for the proximity, short commute, easy access, low friction. He cooked rice and ate at the kitchen counter because he hadn't bought a dining table yet, and he'd been telling himself for 2 years he'd get around to it. He was almost asleep when his phone showed a motion alert from the lobby camera app. He'd installed it himself. Abbott, the kind of low-cost security measure that takes 10 minutes and mostly captures delivery people and neighbors. The alert was from the street-level exterior camera, across from his building's entrance. A vehicle, dark, parked at the curb with its lights off. Still there at midnight. Still there at 2 a.m. when Yuan checked again. He didn't call anyone. He wrote down the plate number on a notepad by his bed, turned the phone face down, and lay in the dark staring at the ceiling with his mind doing what it always did, running the math, calculating the variables, trying to find the equation that fit. By 6 a.m., the vehicle was gone. He checked the news before he got out of bed. The article had been picked up overnight by 2 larger outlets. And somewhere in the comments sections and the reshares and the rapid social acceleration of a story that hits a nerve, somewhere in all of that noise, his old name was trending. Not his current name. Not Yuan. The name he'd left behind. The one that belonged to a version of himself he'd spent years building distance from. The one that connected to a story he hadn't told anyone. Not HR. Not the journalist. Not Tajuan. Someone had found the thread, and they were pulling it. Park Juna held a press conference on a Wednesday. He didn't call it that. His team released a statement through a private legal communications firm that described it as a personal address regarding ongoing matters of public and legal relevance, which was the way people who had expensive lawyers said press conference when they didn't want the word press conference attached to their name before the cameras rolled. Yuan watched it on his laptop from a conference room on the 16th floor with the blinds drawn. Juna was polished. That was the first thing. He wore a charcoal suit and stood at a podium and spoke in the practiced, unhurried cadence of someone who had been coached extensively on not looking like he had been coached. He had strong features and an easy posture and the kind of confidence that reads as authority until you look closely enough to see its performance. He spoke for 11 minutes. Most of it was legal language dressed up as personal disclosure. He referenced a private bond established under lawful ceremony. He referenced a documented biological and legal claim. He said the words "my mate" twice. He said mutual consent once, in a way that was careful enough that no one could quote it directly as a lie. Then he held up his phone and displayed a photograph. A scar. The marking scar that bond ceremonies left. Physical, permanent, the kind that bond law in several jurisdictions recognized as prima facie evidence of claim. The scar was visible, high resolution, clearly showing the mark on the left side of the neck, curved, distinctive. Yuan knew that scar. He also knew exactly when and how it had gotten there, and it had nothing to do with consent. He closed the laptop, sat in the dark of the conference room for a moment with his hands flat on the table. He had kept that piece of his history locked away so completely that for a long time he'd almost been able to believe the lock was permanent. That what happened before Baiko, before the city, before the name Yuan and the life he'd assembled around it, that all of it could stay contained. Archived. Not gone, but inaccessible. Park Juna had just broadcast a photograph of it on a live stream with 40,000 viewers. His phone rang. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. It rang again. He answered. "This is Dr. Nam's office." The voice was formal, careful. "We're calling regarding a legal bond forensics inquiry. Dr. Nam has been contacted by a third-party legal team to provide records on a procedure conducted approximately 4 years ago. A pause. We'd like to speak with you before we respond to that request." Yuan's hand tightened on the phone. Dr. Nam. He knew that name. He knew exactly what procedure they were referencing, and he knew what those records would show, and he knew why Juna's legal team wanted to get to them first. "When?" Yuan said. "Tomorrow morning, if possible. This is time-sensitive." He ended the call, stood up, walked to the window and looked out through the gap in the blinds at the city below. 40 stories of ordinary afternoon. People moving, cabs running, the whole indifferent machinery of a city that didn't know his name, either of his names, and didn't care. His phone buzzed. A message from Tajuan's assistant. "Mr. Morrow is requesting a brief meeting at your convenience. He says it's not urgent." His words. "But she should probably know what I found." Tajuan's team had found something, and they already knew. Which choice do you think was harder? Staying silent to survive, or speaking when someone finally made it possible? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Dr. Nam was already shaking when Yuan walked in. That was the first thing. Not the office. The office was clean, clinical, the kind of medical space that has framed credentials on every wall to remind you that the person behind the desk went to school for a very long time. The credentials were there. The diplomas were there. Dr. Nam was behind the desk in a pressed white coat with a coffee mug she hadn't touched. And her hands, when she set them flat on the desk, were not steady. Yuan sat down. He didn't speak first. He'd learned that waiting cost less than opening. Dr. Nam looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you, I have never told anyone. Not in 4 years. Not once. I understand." I need you to understand that I was pressured, that I was given a choice that wasn't a real choice, that at the time I was, she stopped, reorganized. It doesn't matter what I was. What matters is what I did. Yuan waited. She opened a file on her desk. Printed pages. Medical records with a date stamp that matched the year Yuan had spent trying to forget existed. The marking procedure performed on you was not standard, she said. The pheromone compound used during the ceremony was enhanced. Synthetically, the enhancement was designed to accelerate bond imprinting on one side, yours, without triggering the reciprocal biological response in the other party. She looked up. Meaning Park Jina never bonded to you. The chemistry was entirely one-directional, artificially induced. The room was very still. Yuan heard his own breathing. That's not legal, he said. No, that's not even close to legal. No. She pressed her hands harder against the desk. The compound was sourced through a pharmaceutical contact I was introduced to by a third party I never met in person. I was told the procedure was a standard enhanced ceremony. I was told both parties had consented to the enhancement. I was told. She closed her eyes briefly. I was told a great many things that I chose to believe because the alternative was a conversation I didn't want to have. Yuan thought about the scar on his neck. The one that Juna had photographed and displayed on a live stream with 40,000 viewers. The one that bond law in 3 jurisdictions treated as legal evidence of claim. A scar from a procedure he had been told was standard. A bond he had never actually formed. I'm filing a forensic challenge, said a voice from the doorway. Both of them turned. Tajuan. He was standing with his jacket on and a folder under his arm and the particular expression he wore when he had already decided something 3 steps before anyone else in the room knew there was a decision to be made. The forensic challenge goes through the bond court registry, he said, walking in and sitting in the chair beside Yuan without being invited to. It requires a licensed medical examiner to review the original procedure records and submit a biological analysis of the bond marker compound. If Dr. Nam's records show what she's described, the court can move to declare the bond legally void. He set the folder on the desk. I've already filed the preliminary request. Hearing is scheduled for Friday. Dr. Nam stared at him. Who are you? Someone who read the bond law statutes carefully. He didn't elaborate. Yuan looked at him. Something in his chest shifted, not warmth exactly. Recognition. The specific feeling of watching someone build scaffolding around a problem you've been inside of so long you forgot it had an outside. Thursday came. Juna's team countered. Filed an emergency motion to delay the forensic review. Cited procedural grounds, documentation timelines, jurisdictional overlap. The kind of legal maneuver that doesn't win cases, it buys hours. Yuan's attorney. One Tajuan had connected him to a bond law specialist named Adrian Wakefield who had a reputation for being unreasonably prepared. Responded to the motion in under 2 hours. The court denied the delay. Friday morning. The bond hearing was scheduled. Confirmed. On record. Yuan was in the hallway outside the courtroom when his phone buzzed with a news alert. Juna had given a second interview. A different outlet this time, one with a significantly larger audience. He was smiling in the thumbnail. And at the bottom of the article, a pull quote. She's already mine. The biology doesn't lie. Yuan put his phone in his pocket. Walked into the courtroom. And for the first time in 4 years, he didn't calculate the cost of the door he was opening. He just walked through it. The story had gotten too big to contain on a single thread. By Thursday evening, the night before the bond hearing, there were 4 separate media narratives running simultaneously, and none of them were coordinated and all of them were true. The first was the Baiko story. The harassment cover-up piece had now been picked up by a major financial news network. They'd run a longer segment that included an interview with a former Baiko employee who declined to be named but confirmed that internal complaints had been buried at the director level for, in their words, at least 3 years. The compliance audit Tajuan had filed was referenced twice. Choi Min-jae's suspension was confirmed on record. Baiko's media team had issued a statement that said nothing 3 different ways. The second thread was the bond law story. Legal analysts had begun covering the forensic challenge as a case study in bond law exploitation. Two law professors had given quotes. The words, non-consensual imprinting, appeared in print for the first time in this context. It was the kind of language that, once it exists in a headline, doesn't go back into the container. The third thread was about the grooming policy violations. An education policy journalist, separate from the finance reporter Tajuan had originally contacted, had connected Baiko's internal behavior patterns to a broader piece she'd been building about institutional grooming in high-income corporate environments. She had sources inside 3 other financial firms. Baiko was now one data point in a much larger map. The fourth thread, that was the one that mattered most. Someone had leaked footage. Not the stairwell footage. Not the security camera records from Baiko's internal system. Apartment footage. Exterior surveillance from a residential building. Not Yuan's building, but the one across the street, angle pointing toward his entrance, showing a vehicle parked at the curb on 3 separate nights. Same plate, same hours, lights off each time. It was on social media before Yuan knew it existed. He found it through a notification. Someone had tagged the plate number in a thread about the bond case. The comments were already running. People had cross-referenced the plate to a registered LLC. The LLC connected, through 2 layers of shell registration, to a name that hadn't appeared in any of the other threads yet. Kang Di-sik. Yuan stood in his apartment kitchen reading that name on his phone screen. His father's name. Not his foster father. Not the man who'd taken him in after the disownment, who'd given him a room and a different city and the space to rebuild something. His biological father. The one who had looked at him at 22 and said that Yuan's existence was a liability that the family couldn't absorb. Who had arranged the legal separation with the same administrative efficiency other people used for tax filings. Kang Di-sik was a name Yuan had not said out loud in 6 years. Now it was in a comment thread with 4,000 replies. He set the phone down, picked it up again. The apartment building across the street had a surveillance system that ran on a 72-hour loop. Someone had pulled and preserved that footage before it cycled. Someone who knew when to look and what angle to pull from and why the plate number mattered. That wasn't a journalist. That was someone who had been watching the building for a different reason. Yuan called Tajuan. 3 rings. I saw it, Tajuan said when he answered. Who pulled the footage? A pause. My team flagged the vehicle after your first alert. We've been running the plate for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Yuan hadn't told him about the vehicle until the morning after. Tajuan had already started running it before Yuan made the call. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed to know where the thread led before I told you who was holding it. Another pause. Measured. Kang Di-sik's financial trail connects to Choi Min-jae. Yuan went very still. There's a payment record. Consultancy fee. Routed through the same LLC that owns the vehicle registration. Dated 8 months ago, 2 months before your Q4 presentation. 2 months before the campaign against you inside Baiko escalated. Tajuan's voice stayed level. This wasn't random, Yuan. Choi was placed. The arson report hadn't come in yet. But it came in at 11:47 p.m. The fire inspector's preliminary findings on the Hargrove Street fire, a building where Yuan had lived for 8 months before moving to his current address, had been sitting in a digital queue for 3 weeks. That night, someone submitted a FOIA request that bumped it forward in the processing order. The finding, deliberate, accelerant detected in 3 separate points of origin in the unit that had been Yuan's apartment. The fire had happened 4 months ago. Yuan had told the building manager it was probably an electrical fault. The building manager had filed it as undetermined. Now it was arson, confirmed deliberate, and the financial trail connecting the vehicle, the Choi placement, and the LLC had one name at the top. Kang Di-sik. Yuan's biological father had been running a quiet, administrative, methodical campaign against his own child for longer than any of the visible threats. While Juna filed false bond claims and Choi executed daily pressure inside Baiko, Kang Di-sik was the structure holding all of it up. The man who had called Yuan a liability had spent years proving he meant it. Tuesday morning, Tajun Moro walked into the BICO board meeting with a manila folder and a USB drive. He sat at the head of the table, not his seat. The chair reserved for the board chair, Everett Okafor, who was seated 2 chairs down and visibly aware of what it meant that Tajun had taken that position. No one corrected him. "Before we begin," Tajun said, "I want to confirm that as of Monday's close, I hold 41% of BICO's outstanding voting shares through direct acquisition and proxy agreements." He set the USB drive in the center of the table. "I also want to confirm that the materials on this drive include the complete financial trail connecting Choi Min-jae's placement within this company to an external party who used BICO's institutional structure as a tool for targeted personal harassment." Silence. Everett Okafor leaned forward. "Tajun, the board has 72 hours to announce a public ethics reform initiative, or I call a shareholder vote." He opened the manila folder, slid individual summary sheets to each board member. 1 page each. Clean. Organized. The kind of document that has already been reviewed by 3 attorneys. The reform package includes mandatory misconduct escalation audits, third-party compliance review, and a protected reporting channel that routes outside HR. He stood. Questions. No one asked questions. That afternoon, BICO's communications team issued a press release. It cited a commitment to institutional accountability and announced the formation of an independent ethics oversight board. The language was careful, corporate, the kind of statement that could have been written by anyone. But the fact that it was issued within 6 hours of Tajun's board meeting, that told the story the press release couldn't say directly. Choi Min-jae's suspension was converted to termination. On record, with cause. Yuan was offered a role the same day. Protected executive position within the restructured compliance division. Direct report to the newly formed oversight board, not to any individual director. A role with actual authority, the kind that didn't require navigating around someone else's agenda to do real work. He sat with the offer for 4 hours. Then he accepted it. Wednesday, Juna's emergency bond delay motion had failed. The forensic review had proceeded. Dr. Nam's testimony was on record. The compound analysis had come back from the independent examiner. Synthetic enhancement confirmed. One-directional imprinting confirmed. Reciprocal bond formation on Juna's side. Absent. Bond court issued a temporary hold on Juna's claim. By Thursday, the hold had converted to an arrest. Not for the bond fraud alone. Bond law violations were complicated and slow. The arrest was tied to something older. A fraud charge that had been sitting in a different jurisdiction for 2 years, connected to a financial instrument Juna had misrepresented during an investment round. The bond case had shaken loose enough attention that investigators who had previously deprioritized the fraud file reopened it. One piece moves. Everything connected to it moves. Yuan heard about the arrest through Adrian Wakefield, his attorney, who sent a 2-sentence message. Juna taken into custody this morning. Bond hearing adjourned pending criminal proceedings. He was in his office when the message came in. He read it twice, set the phone down, went back to the report he was reviewing. He didn't celebrate. Celebration felt wrong. Not because the outcome was wrong, but because the thing being resolved was the kind of thing that shouldn't have needed resolving in the first place. There was no version of winning this that erased the stairwells. The arithmetic of it didn't balance. But it moved. That evening, Tajun's attorney filed a separate civil motion. The evidence showed that someone had paid Choi Min-jae to target Yuan inside BICO. The evidence showed a vehicle surveilling Yuan's home. The evidence showed arson at a previous residence. And all of it traced back to a single financial source. The civil filing named that source directly. The motion was time-stamped at 6:14 p.m. on a Thursday. By 6:47 p.m., BICO's compliance team had received a copy. By 7:03 p.m., a forensic accountant retained by Tajun's firm had flagged something inside the financial trail that hadn't surfaced before. A second payment, larger than the first, routed not to Choi, routed directly to Juna, dated 3 years ago, 1 year before Yuan had ever set foot in BICO's building. The campaign hadn't started when Yuan got the job. It had started before he got it. Someone had known exactly where Yuan would land, had positioned Choi inside the building in advance, had set Juna up as a legal threat to be activated when the time came, had built the whole structure before Yuan walked through the door. That level of coordination required more than money. It required information that only one person had. Someone who had known Yuan's trajectory years in advance. Someone who had been tracking him. The accountant's flag sat in Tajuan's inbox, and the name attached to that second payment was not Kang Di-sik. It was older than that. Institutional. The kind of name that had never appeared in any of the threads because it had never needed to. Until now, the DNA archive file had a password. Yuan had known about the file for 2 years. He'd found it during a records request he'd submitted when he was trying to understand the legal structure of his disownment, trying to find the paperwork, the formal documentation that separated him from the Kang family name in a way the courts would recognize. The records request had come back with most of what he'd asked for, and one file he hadn't. A sealed archive, flagged by a family law firm in Seoul. Password protected. Accessible only through biometric confirmation from a listed primary party. The listed primary party was not Kang Di-sik. Yuan had set the file aside. He didn't have the access, and at the time he told himself it didn't matter. He was building a new life. Forward motion. The archive was behind him. Then Tajuan's forensic accountant found the second payment. And Adrian Wakefield made 3 calls in 2 hours, to the family law firm in Seoul, to a data security attorney in New York, and to a contacts registry office that maintained records for corporate succession documentation. By Friday morning, they had a court order. The archive opened at 9:17 a.m. Yuan was alone when he read it. The file was 43 pages. Most of it was legal language, trust documentation, succession architecture, corporate lineage records that connected the Kang family holdings to a parent structure that predated the family business by 2 generations. He read slowly, the way you read something when you know that the next paragraph is going to change what the previous ones meant. Page 19. A designation. Formal. Witnessed. Dated 15 years ago when Yuan was 14 years old, before the disownment, before Baiko, before any of it. The designation listed Yuan, his birth name, full, as primary successor to the Consolidated Family Trust, contingent on reaching the age of 30 without a competing bond claim invalidating the succession clause. He was 29. His 30th birthday was 11 weeks away. That was why. Not weakness. Not shame. Not the reason Kang Di-sik had given him at 22 when he sat across from his son and said the family couldn't absorb him. That had been a constructed reason. Performed rejection. Yuan had been hidden. Not discarded. Hidden. The succession clause had a challenge mechanism. A competing claimant could contest the designation if they held a legal bond over the primary successor before the age threshold was reached. A bond that predated the 30th birthday would transfer the succession rights to the bonded party's family structure instead. Park Juna's family structure, which connected through 3 corporate layers that the forensic accountant had now fully mapped to the same institutional name attached to the second payment. The Bakisa clan. Old money. Quiet. The kind of organization that didn't appear in headlines because it had never needed to. It moved through proxies and legal instruments and carefully arranged marriages and bond claims. It had been doing this for decades. The Kang Family Trust was one item on a longer list. Yuan was one item on that list. The arson, the surveillance, the Choi placement, the Juna bond fraud. None of it was personal. That was the part that landed hardest. It was structural, administrative. He had been a succession asset that a competing interest was trying to neutralize before a deadline. 11 weeks. He closed the file, sat in the silence of the room. His hands were not shaking. That surprised him. He had expected the shaking. He had spent enough time in rooms waiting for information that would undo something to know what his body usually did. But his hands were flat on the desk and his breathing was even, and the thing moving through him wasn't fear. It was clarity. He had spent 6 years building distance from a name he thought had rejected him. He had built Yuan out of the wreckage of that rejection, The job, the city, the careful quiet life in the apartment with no dining table, the reputation he'd assembled number by number, report by report. He had made himself out of the belief that the family he'd come from had decided he wasn't worth keeping. They'd been hiding him from people who wanted him gone before he could inherit what was already his. His phone rang. Tajuan. I read the file, Yuan said when he answered. A pause. All of it. All of it. Another pause. Longer. The Bakisa clan's legal team filed a motion this morning to challenge the succession designation directly. Now that it's unsealed, they have 30 days to contest. 30 days. Adrian is already building the response, Yuan said. I know. She called me first. A beat. There's something else. What? Kong D-Sik reached out to my office this morning. Through his attorney. Tajuan's voice stayed measured. He wants to meet with you. Yuan looked at the closed file on his desk. The man who had sat across from him at 22 and performed a rejection with the precision of someone reading a prepared statement. Who had looked at his own child and said the word liability without flinching. Who had apparently been protecting a succession designation all along. Does he? Yuan said. Not a question. His attorney used the word urgent. Yuan picked up the file, set it in his bag, stood up. Tell his attorney I'm aware of the timeline, he said. And that I'll be in touch when I decide I'm ready. He walked out of the room. He was not ready yet, but he was no longer afraid. The bond was declared void on a Tuesday. Court order. Official. Signed by a bond registry judge after the forensic review was complete and Dr. Nam's testimony had been entered into evidence and the independent examiner's report had confirmed, in language that left no room for interpretation, that the marking procedure performed 4 years ago had been chemically engineered to simulate consent that was never given. The scar on Yuan's neck would stay. Biology didn't reverse, but the legal claim attached to it was gone. Park Juna received his sentencing recommendation the following week. Bond law fraud. Financial fraud. The second charge carried more weight in the jurisdiction. The fraudulent investment instrument from 2 years prior had been fully documented now, and the prosecution had connected it to the Bakisa clan's broader succession strategy. Juna hadn't been acting alone. He'd been a tool, same as Choi, and the court's handling of him reflected that. A tool still holds responsibility for what it does, but the hand holding the tool got scrutinized separately. The Bakisa clan's legal challenge to the succession designation collapsed inside 3 weeks. Adrian Wakefield had filed a response so thorough that the opposing counsel requested 2 extensions and still came in underprepared. The judge dismissed the challenge with prejudice. The designation stood. Yuan's 30th birthday was 9 days away when Kong D-Sik arrived in the city. They met at a restaurant neutral ground, Yuan's choice, a place with enough ambient noise that the conversation stayed contained. His father was older than the last memory Yuan had of him. That was the visible part, the gray at the temples, the way he moved more carefully than he used to. But the posture was the same. The way he sat as if he was accustomed to being at the center of a room whether or not anyone acknowledged it. Kong D-Sik spoke for most of the meal. Yuan listened. There was an explanation. There was always an explanation. The hiding had been intentional, yes. The dissownment had been a legal instrument designed to remove Yuan from the visible succession line so that the Bakisa clan's surveillance network would stop tracking him as a primary target. The rejection had been constructed. A performance meant to make Yuan's removal from the family look permanent enough that the competing interest would stop monitoring him. I thought distance would protect you, his father said. Yuan looked at him across the table. Distance, Yuan said. Let them set my apartment on fire. Kong D-Sik didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that worked. Yuan ate the rest of his meal, said what needed to be said, set down the terms under which he would engage with the Kong family trust going forward, his terms through his attorney, through documentation, through the same administrative infrastructure his father had always preferred. The succession would proceed. Yuan would take his place in the structure. On his conditions, not his father's. He left the restaurant first. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, full of people navigating their own private architectures of choice and consequence. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold air and just let the noise of it land. His phone buzzed. Tajuan. How'd it go? Not a question. Tajuan rarely asked things he could already read from context. Yuan typed back. On my terms. 3 dots. Then good. I need to show you something. 20 minutes later, he was in the lobby of a building 12 blocks from his own. A newer tower, cleaner lines, the kind of address that appeared in architecture publications. Tajuan was already there. He handed Yuan a single key card. Penthouse across the hall, Tajuan said. Registered in your name as of this morning. Yuan looked at the card. I didn't ask you to do that. No. You bought me an apartment. I made an investment in a specific piece of real estate that happens to be across the hall from mine. Tajuan paused. There's a difference. Yuan almost smiled. Not quite. Why? Tajuan looked at him directly. The same way he'd looked at him in the boardroom the day he'd set the pen down and asked the question that started all of this. Not soft. Not performing concern. Just present. Fully present. The way very few people ever manage to be. Because you spent 6 years building a life with no dining table, Tajuan said. And I think you deserve a table. The silence held. Yuan turned the key card over in his hand. Do you want protection? Tajuan said. Or partnership? Yuan had run the math on a lot of things over the years. He'd calculated risk and cost and exit routes and the price of every door before he opened it. He'd built an entire internal infrastructure out of careful thinking. This one didn't require calculation. Partnership, Yuan said. Tajuan nodded. Like it was the answer he'd already accounted for. Like he'd built the question into the structure from the beginning. Yuan pocketed the key card. Stood there for another moment in the lobby of a building that now had his name on a deed. He thought about the boardroom, the sleeve, the 2 inches of fabric that had shifted at the wrong moment and exposed 6 months of silence to someone who was already paying attention. He thought about what he'd believed that exposure meant: vulnerability, loss of control, the collapse of everything he'd carefully maintained. He'd been wrong about that. The exposure hadn't ended him. It had started the sequence that led here. He walked toward the elevator. You didn't find me because of fate, he said without turning around. Tajuan was quiet behind him. I positioned myself to be found. The elevator doors opened. Yuan stepped in. Hard cut. If the story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and turn on notifications. Every week there's a new story on this channel. Stories about power, survival, and people who refuse to disappear. Drop a comment and tell me, what was the moment in this story that hit you hardest? Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today.